Torrential rains now threatening the Turkish earthquake survivors with deadly diseases. A 3-year-old pulled out alive today, but they've started bulldozing the ruins. The Norfolk farmer who shot intruders has been charged tonight with murder. And how English cricket's coming to terms with having the world's worst test team. Good evening. Torrential rain has added to the misery of the 200,000 survivors of the Turkish earthquake and added to the risk of diseases like cholera and typhoid. A 3-year-old boy was pulled alive from the rubble today, almost a week after he was buried alive. But rescuers have all but given up now, and bulldozers are at work in the damaged buildings. Jonathan Charles is in Adapazarı, one of the cities worst hit by the disaster.
The bulldozers have moved in. Demolition is now the priority, a controversial new policy. Thousands of damaged buildings are being knocked down to halt the spread of disease. Any bodies inside will be scooped up with the rubble. It's a sign that the authorities believe that 6 days after this disaster, there's no point in searching for any more survivors. A final extinguishing of hope. But survivors are still being found, like Ismail Cenar. This afternoon, the young boy was plucked from the debris which was once his home. He's been buried alive for 160 hours. His rescue's given fresh ammunition to those who think the government's bulldozing strategy is premature. Ismail's uncle called it a gift from God. He's buried 4 other members of his family already. For the survivors, misery is being heaped upon misery. First came the earthquake. Now there's torrential rain. Dry clothes are a luxury here. Patience is short as inhabitants of a makeshift camp in Adapazarı queue for the few shirts handed out. To people who have nothing, they are everything. Standing in thick mud, Serhaj Yücelhan told me conditions are becoming intolerable. She lost her parents and her home in last week's earthquake. Now her children are soaking wet. All their remaining possessions have been ruined. Serhaj says the mud is terrible. It's impossible to keep her tent clean. And the worst certainly isn't over yet for these people who've already suffered so much. Further heavy rain is on the way. They face the prospect of a long winter in appalling conditions like this. These are just some of the 200,000 people who'll be sleeping in the rain tonight. When the downpour started, many just burst into tears. They've had about as much as they can take. An emergency hospital next to the camp is preparing for the worst too. The Israelis who run it fear the rain will spread illness, waterborne diseases like cholera and typhoid. The rain could run through houses, sweeping decaying bodies and rubbish out onto the streets.
It may seep into the collapsed buildings where there are many, many bodies still buried and increase the likelihood of decomposition and the water burying the disease, the bacteria, into the water supply of the city.
And this evening, there's a final desperate search for survivors before the bulldozing resumes in the morning. A short while ago, sounds were heard from inside a collapsed house. If someone is brought out alive tonight, this could well be the last rescue from this earthquake. Jonathan Charles, BBC News, Adapazarı.
Shoddy construction work, poor government regulation and greedy property developers are all being blamed for the earthquake's huge death toll. Buildings were put up on unstable ground with no regard for safety. George Ekin reports from one Turkish village where apartment blocks just crumpled up at the first tremors.
It was an act of God, but so many needn't have died. The verdict from residents of these flats at Kordolu by the Sea of Marmara. In one block, 55 lost their lives, in another, 60. Now the remaining buildings lean and pitch at absurd angles, defying gravity just. Testimony, local people say, to the shoddy work of cowboy builders.
Look, the wind would bring this down, says an approved government builder
He claims the cement is weak and crumbly, there aren't enough horizontal supports, and above, tree branches hold up the roof.
Teknik bir şeyleri var. Yani tam teknik şekilde yapılsa.
If the constructor had done his job properly, these buildings wouldn't have come down. The deaths are purely the fault of the construction.
Yapım hatası.
Yet local government officials approved these buildings. They're supposed to have inspected them.
Biz görmedik yani.
We never saw any inspectors come here to check whether the construction was okay, says Mehmet Sahin. So how was approval given? The current mayor is new in the job.
Tamam yani ihmal edilir. İhmal vardır.
The inspectors probably didn't check. If they'd known it was such poor construction, they wouldn't have approved it. What we lack is inspections. Nearing completion, these were new 5-storey apartment blocks. Here are floors 1, 2 and 3. People here blame 2 builders in particular, Tahsin Yeşilka, who erected 2 of the blocks, and his brother Metin, who put up the new ones. Their sister was killed last week. We went to look for them. The mayor of their home village said no one had seen Tahsin or Metin since the earthquake. They were absolutely unreachable. But Tahsin has been staying here at his brother Ali's house. Ali didn't want to be interviewed, but said his brother felt innocent.
Why isn't he ready to make a comment defending himself on camera now?
Yok hayır biz cevap gerekirse mahkemede veririz.
He says we only answer in the court.
This lunchtime we found the bearded Metin near the same house. Also camera shy, he said the buildings had been properly constructed.
Ne gerekiyorduysa o zaman onlar yapıldı.
What we built before the new stricter regulations came in to protect against earthquakes, we built in line with those old regulations.
What's striking is how local officials in this area refer to Tahsin Yeşilka as a well-respected civil engineer, and how many other people, especially those who lived in these flats, want him dead.
Builders all over this region are facing such extreme threats as victims hunt someone to blame. The Turkish government promises harsh punishment for those proven to have done poor construction work. What are we going to do now, sobs one resident at Cordolu as the digger starts demolishing her home. And just out of sight, a cluster of fresh graves scars the hillside in silent accusation. George Eakin, BBC News, Cordolu.
And Jonathan Charles joins me now from Adapazara. Jonathan, it must be a desperately difficult decision to pull out the rescuers and send in the bulldozers.
It is very difficult. You know, what to do with buildings like this one behind me is a real dilemma for the government. It's one of those terrible decisions that sometimes heads of government have to make under terrible circumstances. And these are, of course, terrible circumstances. They could, of course, allow the search to carry on, and they might get 1 or 2 people out during the days ahead. But in the meantime, disease would be rife inside these buildings. The stench from them is absolutely terrible. I was in one just a few minutes ago. The smell is really rising up now from all the decaying bodies. So you would kill hundreds by allowing these buildings to stand. You have to sacrifice a few people, the government says, in order to save more lives. It's a terrible moral decision for the government, and of course one which requires them to acknowledge the emotions of people who say you should carry on searching for our relatives, while at the same time the government has to say, look, we need to take a broader decision. It's very painful, but we've got to do it.
There's, 200,000 survivors out there in the rain tonight. What's the future likely to be for them?
I think it's going to be absolutely dreadful. Someone was telling me today they expect to be in camps like the one we were in a few hours ago for as long as 12 months. That's an awful long time throughout the winter. They get a lot of rain in this part of the world in winter. We've already seen today what rain can do to the campsite, the mud. There are young children playing in the mud. Of course, that too brings disease.
Jonathan Charles, thanks very much. Here, a farmer has been charged with murdering a 16-year-old suspected burglar at his home in Norfolk. Tony Martin, who lives in a farmhouse near Wisbeach, is also accused of wounding a 29-year-old man with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. He'll appear before King's Lynn magistrates tomorrow.
Forensic officers remain on site some 3 days after the shooting. The whole farm, its orchards and yards, remain sealed off.
We are establishing, or we think we are establishing, what has occurred that Friday night out at Emneth, but it is a difficult inquiry. There are teams of officers, not only in Newark, but also here in Norfolk, trying to piece together the clues.
This is a remote area, and people are distraught at the killing. 54-year-old Tony Martin lived on his own on his 350-acre farm. It's reported he'd been burgled twice before. The police were called to his home at just before midnight on Friday. But it was a further 12 hours before they found the body of 16-year-old Fred Barras. He was from Newark in Nottinghamshire, and his family are devastated by his death.
Fred was no model teenager, but all he'd done is petty theft and whatever. He's never hurt nobody in his life. He's never, he's never gone intendedly to hurt anybody or like that. And I know he shouldn't have been on that man's place, but in saying that, you can replace goods, but you can't replace his life, can you?
The police say they're likely to have a presence here at Emneth until the end of the week. Norfolk police had until 6 o'clock this evening to continue with their questioning of Tony Martin. Just before it was announced he was to be charged with the murder of a 16-year-old youth and a secondary charge of wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. He'll appear before magistrates in King's Lynn tomorrow morning. Richard Bilton, BBC News, Emneth in Norfolk.
The Home Secretary, Jack Straw, has published plans to move asylum seekers to a number of towns in England and Wales. Earlier today, he met immigration officials to discuss ways of speeding up processing asylum applications. 10 years ago, 4,000 asylum seekers came to Britain. The figure for last year was 46,000.
Would-be refugees at a day centre in London today hardly needed to be told the system was in chaos. With an 80,000 backlog of applications, there's little hope their cases will be resolved swiftly. This man from the Ivory Coast arrived in Britain last November. He told me he had his first full interview with immigration officials 6 months later and will now hear nothing more until December.
It's really bad for people like me who are really expecting international protection. No, it's good maybe to be safe in the UK, but it's not enough.
Staff here where applications are processed say the system's close to collapse. The claims are coming in faster than the huge backlog can be cleared. Delays caused by a new computer system have made the situation worse.
The increase is happening because Britain is regarded as a soft touch at the moment. The main reason it's a soft touch is that the processes are so slow. For example, at Dover, there's a queue of 4 years to get a first interview. That's how long before anyone is spoken to.
The Conservatives say the recent influx of asylum seekers, many turning up clandestinely at ports, is solely the fault of the Home Secretary, Jack Straw.
How come that we left him a declining situation in terms of the numbers of applications, and they have now risen to record levels? He must be responsible for that.
The Home Secretary nevertheless says it's a Tory legacy, but he insists Britain's not alone in Europe in having to respond to political instability in the Balkans and elsewhere.
Other countries like Germany, of similar size to ours, have taken many hundreds of thousands more asylum seekers than have we, and proportionate to our population, we're about 10th out of 15 European countries.
Refugee groups say it's now time for the government to act, rather than score party political points.
It is true they were left with a terrible mess by the last government, but frankly, after 2.5 years, I think they're running out of excuses. And we've heard this story about collapsing computers and about unexpected surges in numbers too many times.
While the political row is centred on who's to blame and whether Britain is too soft or too harsh on asylum seekers, there's a danger the real issue will be overshadowed. It's that the system for dealing with asylum seekers is in a mess, and there's little hope of any real improvement in the short term. Jane Peel, BBC News.
A friend of the black teenager, Stephen Lawrence, who was with him when he was murdered, is suing the police for their handling of the case. Dwayne Brooks is suing the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Paul Condon, 15 police officers and the Crown Prosecution Service. He says he should be compensated for the way he was treated during the investigation. Police in Leeds are considering whether to prosecute a man who left his baby daughter at a police station so he could go on holiday. He left 18-month-old Chloe on a station counter before flying to Spain. She's now being looked after by her grandmother. Hundreds of children who'd been held hostage by rebels in the war-ravaged state of Sierra Leone have been reunited with their families. They were freed as part of a recent peace deal, which aims to end 8 years of civil war in the former British colony. But as Ben Brown reports, many have been terribly scarred by their experiences.
Rebel leaders in Sierra Leone are among the cruelest men in Africa, but this day they were feeling generous. They had decided to release some of the children they kidnapped during this country's civil war. It was a gesture, they said, a gesture for peace.
As we've promised earlier on, that we are committed to peace. So these are some of the things that we are now doing to demonstrate our commitment.
200 children were allowed to go home. In a land of barbarity and brutality, this was a rare moment of joy. What they've been through is unimaginable. Boys turned into child killers, girls into sex slaves. Now they were on the road to freedom, but thousands more children like them remain in captivity.
The only ones who are currently being released are the ones who are severely malnourished, sick, pregnant, are probably the weakest of the camp followers and no longer needed. And so they become a burden. They have to feed them, take care of them. It's easier to let them go.
Next to a beach that looks like paradise, there's a rehabilitation camp for these children who have been to hell. Here there are eyes that have seen far more than any child's ever should. Aminata Murray is a social worker. She takes down the names of the children who've just been released. Then their families can be traced and they can be reunited. Aminata herself has a younger sister who was kidnapped, and while we were filming here, she suddenly saw her among the new arrivals. First, there are beaming smiles, of course, but then almost immediately there are tears as well. For Aminata's sister, who is still a schoolgirl, reports that she has been repeatedly raped by the rebels and that now she is pregnant.
All the family was worried about her, but fortunately this morning I found her at this place. I was very overjoyed, but the only thing that got me much was that I found her pregnant.
Other desperate relatives come here to try and find their loved ones too, but they have to stay outside the gates while names are checked. Mothers and fathers face an agonizing wait to see if their children are among the fortunate few to have been set free. For these parents, the ordeal has been almost unbearable, knowing that their children had not only been kidnapped, but also quite possibly raped, tortured, brainwashed, given drugs and coerced into killing. After the horrors perpetrated against these children, maybe their innocence has been swept away forever. But here on Paradise Beach, they are at least trying to rediscover their childhoods. Ben Brown, BBC News, Sierra Leone.
The Northern Ireland Secretary Mo Mowlam has apparently disagreed in public with the Irish Foreign Minister David Andrews over whether the IRA is still observing its ceasefire. Mr Andrews said they both believed the terrorist group's 2-year ceasefire was intact, but Ms Mowlam immediately qualified that, saying she had yet to make her decision on the matter.
David Andrews arrived at Stormont to discuss with Mo Mowlam the state of the IRA ceasefire and whether or not it had been broken. Afterwards, there was some confusion as to what they'd agreed.
In the round, we came to the conclusion that the ceasefire was still intact.
No, I think I made it clear we did reach that conclusion.
Right.
But I am waiting for additional information from America and from the Irish before I make a final decision.
Concerned a public rift on such a sensitive issue could be very damaging, both ministers insisted there was no disagreement between them.
But it would be wrong to leave you with the impression that there was any disagreement as to the analysis so far, but I would rather hold to the final decision for a day or two.
As journalists pushed for further clarification, Dr Mowlam's body language clearly showed her unease with the Irish Foreign Minister's remarks. Eventually, she walked off as he continued to field questions. The additional information Dr Mowlam is awaiting is from the US authorities about an IRA gun-running operation uncovered last month. But it appears she doesn't regard IRA involvement in the murder of Belfast taxi driver Charles Bennett as a breach of its ceasefire. It seems an unguarded comment from the Irish Foreign Minister has revealed Mo Mowlam's hand on the IRA ceasefire issue. At the moment, she is of the opinion that it holds good, and it would take cataclysmic new evidence from America to change that verdict, a verdict that will enrage many unionists just ahead of a review of the Good Friday Agreement, which it's hoped will rescue the peace process. Tom Coulter, BBC News, Stormont.
The first consignment of British beef to be exported since the worldwide ban was imposed by the European Union 3 years ago is to cross the Channel tonight. The 48 kilos of steak are bound for Brussels, where they'll be eaten at a celebration lunch later this week. But farmers here acknowledge it'll be difficult to win back the market share that they had before the BSE crisis.
The journey to Brussels began on this Cornish farm 3 weeks ago. John Hicks breeds prime beef cattle. At the beginning of August, he sent a dozen to his local slaughterhouse. It's meat from these that will cross the Channel tonight.
It's a chink of light, and hopefully St Mirren can build on the exports, and it'll be good for all farming.
The animals were slaughtered and the beef hung for a fortnight to mature. It was stamped and labelled with a number, so each animal can be identified and its history traced to prove it's been BSE-free all its life. The EU's imposed such strict conditions for lifting the ban, this Cornish abattoir is the only in the UK to fulfil them. It's had to set up a new export plant and pay for 2 new meat inspectors who check the beef's off the bone and from young animals. There's far less beef now than before the ban that's even eligible for export. Yet foreigners worried about BSE are still reluctant to buy it.
It is going to be a gradual evolution of product going into Europe. It's going to be very, very small in comparison to where it was 3.5 years ago.
This morning, the first beef was loaded onto a refrigerated lorry and sealed in by a government inspector. But as it headed for the Kent ferries, much of the beef processed for export remains in the abattoir fridges. The French and Germans are still refusing to let it in. It'll be months before foreign markets pick up. Today's beef run to Brussels is symbolic. The customer is the British Meat and Livestock Commission, which is holding a lunch in Belgium to promote British beef. But persuading foreign consumers to buy it is proving extremely difficult. This evening, the lorry arrived in Ramsgate. There to see it off, the Agriculture Minister insists foreign consumers can be persuaded to buy British beef again.
The government is spending £4.6 billion worth of taxpayers' money, mostly UK taxpayers. We get some help from our friends in the European Union, but to make sure that British beef is safe. Now exports have recommenced and we have a chance of rebuilding our share in world markets.
For the meat industry, this first Channel crossing in more than 3 years is a sign the biggest crisis in its history may be drawing to a close. But only a fraction of what used to go abroad is likely to be exported now the ban's lifted. Margaret Gilmore, BBC News.
Within the last few minutes, the English Rugby Union has dropped its drug charge against the former England captain Lawrence Dallaglio. Dallaglio resigned the post after a Sunday newspaper claimed that he'd taken and sold drugs. But he was recalled to the team for a match against the United States on Saturday. England's cricket selectors have been meeting at Lord's and fending off a tide of scathing criticism for the team's abysmal performance against New Zealand. Supporters at the Oval yesterday jeered and booed as England lost 7 wickets for just 39 runs, and with them the Test series. According to the unofficial table of results compiled by the Cricket Almanac Wisden, Australia are Test cricket's top side, followed by the West Indies and South Africa. But having lost to New Zealand, England are now the worst in the world.
These English cricketers are the world champions. They've just beaten Australia in a one-day series, and at lunch on the first day of the first 4-innings Test match at Bristol against the mighty Aussies, they've got them 7 wickets down for 123. But these world beaters are the England under-19 team. Another wicket, 128 for 8. The under-19s have grown used to winning, a habit the senior side has lost.
The transition from under-19 cricket to Test cricket has proved to be a tricky one. We've produced some good cricketers at this age group. As you say, we're beating the Australian Academy at the moment, which we're very proud and pleased of. We've beaten a lot of other countries at this age group, including Pakistan, and drawn with Australia, at least South Africa. It's something we've got to look very carefully at.
The success of the under-19s and the England A team is the only ray of hope in a bleak outlook for English cricket, now bottom of the unofficial Test match league.
I think it's a lack of consistency in the selection process. Something obviously goes wrong between under-19 level, which is this level here, and the Test cricket.
It's the sort of fighting to-win spirit that seems to be lacking.
We need more youngsters and some new faces.
The English cricket authorities say their aim is to restore England's fortunes.
Somehow they've got to turn these excellent young English players into the test-class performers of the future. As events yesterday at the Oval clearly demonstrated, this is not happening yet.
English county cricket is thought to be too soft, not producing enough competition, and the ECB has introduced 2 divisions to try to overcome that. And discussions have been taking place today about putting England players on special contracts. The Australian under-19s bowled out before tea for 153 today are graduates of the famed Australian Academy of Cricket, which has produced test stars like Shane Warne. The director of the academy says down under, good players get into the test side when they're ready.
What I like to see is when a kid leaves the academy full-time, that he's prepared to play first-class cricket. Now, if he's 16 or if he's bloody 30, it doesn't matter. And the fact that the matter is that hopefully we will have prepared them to be capable of playing first-class cricket.
A good day for England, ending on 195 for 4. The England under-19 players all want to get into the test side. It's up to English cricket to make sure they're still world-class when they do so. Adam Minot, BBC News, Bristol.
And the main news again tonight, torrential rains now threatening the Turkish earthquake survivors with deadly diseases. And a Norfolk farmer who shot intruders has been charged with murder. That's it. That's all from the 9 o'clock news. Good night.